clearly working on a business visa, then instead of the slap on the wrist that they used to give you before, they'll now kick you in the head. So I hate to use such a violent analogy, but the reality is that the penalties for non-compliance are going to be significantly increased, and the company, not just the individual, are going to be held responsible for that. In Belgium, there was a huge increase in the number of auditors. The Belgian government announced the recruitment, it was a couple of years ago, the recruitment of an additional 1,000 people that would be inspecting, do site inspections, and they do this through the social insurance inspectors. So a massive increase in inspections. With that sort of number, we all know Belgium is about the size of this conference room, and so they managed to get around to most of the companies. So 2009, there was a record number of incidences of non-compliance in Belgium. 1,676 actions were taken against individuals and companies for incidences of non-compliance. 2010, that is significantly increased. They have issued guidelines, and they're one of the few countries I know that have now issued guidelines in relation to business visa usage. And so what they're saying, and I find this an extraordinarily restrictive interpretation, but what they're saying is that any activity, business visa activity, that requires a stay in Belgium of more than 5 days in a month would ordinarily require a work permit. So 5 days in a month. If you're there for more than that, then it requires a work permit. That, to me, seems awfully restrictive, but that's the environment in which we are now working. To Cindy and the other panel's point earlier on, immigration has no friends. And there is no constituent group to support immigration issues and companies, because the expatriates don't get to vote, and the companies are really not prepared to step up and speak out unless it's really extreme in relation to legislative change. So there's no real voice there. Some further examples: in Ireland, an increase in the labour market testing requirements. It's now compulsory that there be labour market testing requirements. The period of the advertisement needs to be extended, and they now completely assess the reality of that advertisement. So it's no longer just throwing in an ad and saying, you must have these certain skills. The first name must be Anil. You now must show that it's a genuine ad and the extent to which we've actually truly tested the labour market. Let me talk a little bit about penalties and how this fits. So in Germany, as an example, incidences of non-compliance for the individual, and these are civil offences, for the individual, the penalty is a fine of up to 5,000 euros for the offence. So this is if you're working on a business visa, as an example. Up to 5,000 euros, plus deportation, which is unpleasant, plus a ban on re-entering the Schengen region. That's the whole of the Schengen region, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And then for the company, there is a fine of up to 500,000 euros for the same offence. Plus, so that's €500,000. That's a lot of money. Plus, more importantly, depending on whether you're the financial controller or not, the fact that your company will then come under scrutiny for future applications. So future denials of applications would be on the card. So that's the issue. I talked a little bit about the Schengen region, and there's just one point I want to clarify, because again, it's a source of great confusion, and that is the rule about the Schengen region. It is actually quite simple, and that is, and Fiona should speak to this, she's far more expert than I, but within the Schengen region, it's 90 days within 180 days in the region, not in each of the countries that make up the region, as the rule So you have to understand that distinction. I come across this all the time. Because otherwise you'll be just jumping from country to country and actually remaining permanently on a Schengen visa. That's not going to work. And so these are just some of the sort of guidelines about the legislative changes occurring in the UK. But we talked about the other issue, that was the illustration. The other issue is more restrictive interpretation of existing laws. Much more difficult for an advisor like myself to advise on, because this is where there are guidance notes that are being issued to immigration officers around the world, in regions, to take a stricter interpretation of the law. You often don't know about this until it's too late, until you're already having people turned around at the airport, or inspections taking place, and you suddenly discover what was permissible in the past is no longer permissible going forward. And so you have this issue. An example of this, combined with the new legislation, would be the minimum salary level in the United Kingdom. A lot of companies skate right on the minimum salary level, right on. So what that means is that if it's £32,000 as the minimum salary level, they will pay the equivalent of £32,000 to the penny. And that is okay, you know, legally that's legally, that's right, just yell. Thanks. So can everyone still hear me? So legally, except I forgot what I was saying. Legally, you're right on the minimum salary level. So that's perfectly acceptable. But you make one mistake. You make a mistake in relation to what's allowable within that calculation, or the government changes the interpretation of what's allowable. Can you include a housing allowance? Can you include a per diem in that calculation? And please don't ask me the specifics, I don't know. It all comes down to it. Now, an example of this, and the rigidity, I talked about the rigidity earlier. An example of this is a company that has a large number of people going into the UK who had, over the course of 10 months, had a calculation error. It was actually a formula error on an Excel spreadsheet on the minimum salary level. And they cut it so fine, over that 10-month period, they had more than 300 breaches of the minimum salary level because of this calculation. So you think, okay, we'll just explain to the British government and it'll be fine. Well, ordinarily that would be the case, except that in this political environment, the UK government looked at that as 300 breaches of the Act. And we're working on the penalties as a result of that, which could have been significant money. We managed to talk them out of that, but going forward, I think the tolerance for that sort of issue is going to be significantly less. So, you know, as immigration experts within your organisation, I would strongly encourage you to get that message out that you can't cut it so fine that you run the risk of being in that sort of level of breach. And then I've talked already about increased enforcement activity, site visits and audits, so I don't need to go through that. And I really want to leave time for the panel and for questions. So I'm going to skip through these next couple of slides because we've sort of talked about it. And I'm going to get to some of the practical issues. I talked about business visas, and as I said, I used to be a diplomat and work in the immigration department in Australia. I was actually the first secretary, the head of immigration here in the Australian High Commission in New Delhi for 2 years. And so